we're wrapping up our grain series, and our presentation today is really focused on the work that the Northern Grain Growers Association has been doing over the winter months. And this may not look like work to you. This may seem like fun and traveling and visiting and eating, but that is our work. And trying to get out this winter, again, because we didn't have time for our winter conference, not time, but we weren't ready yet. And as an organization, we've been really trying to regroup after COVID, figure out who we are, what we want to do, and what we want to accomplish to support the grain industry here in the Northeast. And as part of that, some of our board decided that we should go out and really touch base with some of our colleagues, some of the grain-focused businesses throughout the Northeast, and really try to, start communicating again in person and building relationships, rebuilding relationships that I don't want to say we're lost, but maybe not as well maintained as we could have done them throughout COVID. And today we're going to talk about the field trip we had this winter, a couple of them, and, highlighting some of the things we learned and where we think, we're going to be heading and what we're really excited about. So we've asked a few of the board members, Seth Johnson, Sean Jang, Todd Hardy, Randy George, and myself to, talk about those trips. So I appreciate everybody showing up today. And we called it the Northern Grain Growers Hit the Road. And we visited SILO Distillery and Harpoon here in Vermont. And then we took a field trip to New York to visit many of our farmer friends and mills and businesses that we've worked with over the years to touch base and see what they were up to. So again, for those of you that are new to the Northern Grain Growers Association, the mission of our group is to promote the renewal and growth of grain cultivation in the Northeast by supporting farmers and building a local grain economy. And we've been, again, kind of not necessarily changing our mission, but just really focused on how are we going to deploy that and what are we going to do as an organization to follow through. So become a member. We've asked everyone, it's cheap. Not that that should be a selling point, but it's affordable. Let's say that. And here's a QR code. Here's a link. There's many benefits to becoming a member, and we're trying to grow those and get back to our conferences and in-person events and really get our newsletter more regular again. And we just would really appreciate your support as we all work together to grow the Northern grain industry. I wanted to take a second to make another plug. Our Grain Growers Association and the University of Vermont and Glenwood Farm, many of you know June Russell, are working on rye and some projects focused on adding value to rye. And we are conducting a market survey focused on rye. And we hope, I know some of you may have received this through other avenues, but if you haven't yet, we'd really like to hear from you. And this survey is for end users of rye and also farmers. So Anna's going to put the information in the chat as well, and it will be in our next newsletter. And again, we'd appreciate it if you're interested in the rye market, growing rye, if you could answer this survey for us. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd Hardy, one of our board members, and he's going to talk about our trip to SILO.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Heather. I am also in the Northeast Kingdom, and we have about 8 inches of snow on the ground. And I'm always happy when the rye crop is insulated and has received so much nitrogen from the snow. Our first trip was to SILO Distillery on the banks of the Connecticut River in Windsor, Vermont, right across the parking lot from Harpoon Brewery. On the right in this picture, we see the co-founder, Anne Marie Delaney, who with her husband built a very impressive distillery, and she was a gracious host. We are seeing the distilling room where there's beautiful equipment from Carl, an old fabrication company in Germany. And we're looking at Raynox tanks, stainless steel tanks, which are made in Quebec and not too far from Vermont. I've been up there with pickup trucks a couple of times to pick them up. It's nice to see local equipment too. One thing impressive about SILO is they're getting grain from a farm in Rutland County, Vermont, which is great and wonderful. Most distilleries in Vermont are still buying grain from out of state that is more conventional and part of huge farms out in the West. Here we see the Carl equipment, the copper equipment at SILO Distillery. Copper is important for pulling sulfides out of spirits. And when you go to a distillery and see all this copper, there's a good reason for that. SILO has a beautiful tasting room, also with a copper top. And we were given samples of their vodka and whiskey, and also of their canned cocktails, which was in the very last picture, this one here, with the purple cans. Last year during the pandemic, Vermont followed other states in allowing distilleries to bring canned cocktails to the marketplace through grocery stores, as well as their standard channels of the 802 spirit stores. By regulation, the alcohol by volume in these canned cocktails cannot be higher than 12%. And they have a very nice production line at SILO for their canned cocktails. This that we're seeing here is a lovely mixture of lavender and vodka. We have more Raynox Quebec tanks on the left. And here we're looking at a room with their boiler on the left and bags of grain. Here's their tasting room. Vermont was one of the early states to allow tasting in distilleries and direct sales. There are still states in our country where the product has to go to a warehouse by the distillery, bought back by the distillery at a higher price, and then sold to the public. Vermont was wise to realize that supporting distilleries helped with farms, tax revenue, and jobs. And SILO has a lovely tasting room, just a couple hundred feet from the banks of the Connecticut River. It's beautiful there. They built their distillery to look like a barn, and we might see pictures of that from the exterior coming up. It's a very modest place, very beautiful.
So that's all the photos we have,
Okay.
Todd, before we move on to the other location. But
Okay.
if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind adding in a comment as well.
Of course.
So for me, this was a really full circle for me. So yesterday was my 20th year here at UVM, believe it or not. And that day when I walked in there, I was with Hillary and Sophia that are here in this picture. And, or I'm sorry, I think it was Sophia and Anna. And we walked in and we introduced ourselves. And immediately there was just this smile. And both the owners of SILO saying, "You're Heather Darby? We've never met you before, but our whole story starts with our first phone call to you, because we had this vision of creating SILO Distillery and buying and supporting local farms. And somebody told us to call you, and they did. And that was 16 years ago, I think they said. And I told them about a couple of local farmers near their to-be new site, and they're still working with one of those farmers today. So for me, it was just sort of this, it just came really full circle to the work that we've done over the time that the Northern Grain Growers has been together. So it was really a highlight of the tour to me to see that somebody that called, that, you know, had a conversation, and we took the time to figure out how to connect them with somebody that grew local grain, that they were able to build that relationship and an entire business around that over the past now 16 years. So it left me a little teary-eyed in a way, thinking like, wow, you know, we have done some really great things, and look at this business. And I still work with that grain farm today, and that grain farm now is really run by the son, and now the son has sort of taken on growing grain. So I have to say that was not at all planned in the tour, and it was really wonderful. I think, you know, for those of us that, you know, started doing this work a while ago, and of course they mentioned Jack Laser too, Seth and Todd, and how much he helped them along the way. So the Grain Growers Association has made a significant impact that sometimes we don't know or can even celebrate because we don't know. So that was pretty cool for me.
Great.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add that that's really not an anomaly either, Heather. It's really, I think many people probably on this call can testify to the important network we have here as part of the Northern Grain Growers Association. I can't help but see, I think Ben's on recent, and actually the first combine I ever bought was in right around that time, probably 2006 or so. I was working for Jack at the time, and the way I found it is I just talked to Heather, and Heather's like, I think Ben's selling his old case combine, buying a newer, I think it was a Massey or something. And so anyway, I had that combine for many years, but it was really thanks in large part to this network we have, which is really important.
Oh, shoot. Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, so go ahead, Todd.
Before we move on, I just wanted to add a few thoughts about the other tours in my appointed time after you finish.
No, I'm done.
Okay.
I leaned over and hit the button on my keyboard, and all the slides started moving. Sorry.
The trips did bring us together. It was incredible collaboration. With Peter Martins, it was wonderful to meet him. The planning that goes into getting grain when you need to buy it does not always allow one to contract with a farmer before the grain is planted. And when I've called Peter Martins up to get 5 tons of organic barley for the second ingredient in Caledonia Spirits whiskey, he always has it and can ship within a few days. 1,900 acres, 3 families, drying, cleaning, and storage. It was impressive. I was touched by Peter talking with his father about the transition from one generation to the next, and how Klaus supported Peter to get his first loan when Peter was 15. With Thor Oechsner, I used to dismiss the big old clippers, wooden machines from the 1950s, thinking they were outdated. But going to New York and being with Thor completely changed that. He has two of them. One is a clipper and one is a equivalent. I saw one of these at Sean O'Donnell's Rusted Rooster Farm in Maine last week, and it's really opened up the search for me to get one. Sean taught me how to look online to get one out west, maybe $5,000 or so, which is a great deal. We might see pictures of how Thor cleans grain whenever it's moved. We saw a simple fan bolted onto a wheelbarrow. These Finger Lake Central New York farmers are important to what we can learn about and buy organic grain. I was short of rye in the past, and Thor has always had ton totes to sell. And in his organic grain fields, Thor rogues weeds with his fiancee Rachel and helpers. It was just an inspiration to be with them all for the day and the night. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Todd. Anyone else? I mean, Anna, you're on. Anyone else about SILO besides the tasting? That was really fun. And I think I brought some of the canned beverages home, and they were very popular, but they're hard to find up in Alberg. So I'm not sure if I'll ever get them again unless I go back down to SILO.
We'll pick something up for you, Heather.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Yeah,
So-
I recall.
go ahead, Anna.
Anne Marie said that those cans of seltzers or whatever they were one of their best-selling products. I guess really popular or among the young folks, is what she said. I guess maybe COVID helped with that, but
Yeah. Not sure if I fall in that category anymore, but yeah, so this was our first stop that day. And I think some of the lessons I learned was that there are a lot of businesses that are interested in using grains to make their products, but don't always know how to figure out how to get there. And part of what our network does clearly and can do and continue to do is connect farmers with people that are looking for grain. And I think we'll hear more about that as we, I'm sure, go through this presentation. So after we left SILO, we walked across the driveway, down the driveway and across the street to Harpoon Brewery. Just happens they're closely located next to each other. And many of us have worked with Harpoon for years on various projects. And it was conveniently located right next door, and they have a wonderful restaurant. So we went over for lunch. And then we're able to go on a tour of the brewery. So I think, Sean, you're going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can navigate as best as I can through this fairly large brewery. It was really interesting to go through. I don't know if we've all seen Harpoon on a tap room somewhere or in a store, but they're a very well developed brewery, and they have I believe they brew in Boston and in Windsor, Vermont, and a really wide range of brews. And like I said, it's a fairly large facility. I probably couldn't give you how many barrel system they have, but it was definitely really interesting going there. We had a great lunch. And then after that, we were brought into the brewing area. And if somebody remembers the name of the tour guide, please help me out. But I didn't take as many notes as Todd did, so my presentation maybe is slightly lackluster, but
That's okay.
How about the tours in general, Sean? The other ones, New York.
Yeah, no, it's the whole thing was very, very interesting. Me and my wife went with me, Sarah, and we got a lot out of everything. But I believe this picture here, you've got the barrel systems where they're doing the brewing. The picture on the right, that's the barrels where I believe the magic happens there as far as getting your flavors and mixing in your grains. The one on the left is another section of the brewery where I think those pipes were grain. I don't know if that's where the grain came in or where that was, but it was interesting to hear, as us as grain farmers and grain enthusiasts that were touring the place, and even Harpoon seemed a little kind of interested in some local grain, but I don't believe they're using any local grain. They are a fairly large brewery, and their malted barley comes in on a tractor trailer, 25, 30 tons at a time. It gets augered or vacuumed right up into a silo, and they have specific malts that they're using for their beers where they can order a trailer load at a time and then actually add in some other types of malts or grains by the pallet, by the bag. So they did have some questions to some of us grain growers as to barley and stuff on how we grow it in Vermont. So they did seem kind of interested, but I believe the amount that they use in 1 month is basically what Sarah and I grow on our farm for a whole season. So I think they were going through 1 or 2 trailer loads a month at their facility. So very large scale.
Yeah.
They brought us upstairs. They have a pretty extensive lab up there where they're sampling beers, checking for all kinds of different safety measures as far as getting the right brew every time, the right grains, the right malt enzymes and everything. Make sure everything is very, very consistent because they have a large line of beers, and they want to keep it consistent every time somebody grabs those beers, whether on tap or in the bottle. So yeah, and then right through here, this was pretty fun to watch the automation of the bottling station on your right. Just a whole line. It was awfully loud in there. The bottles were clanging together, but it was interesting to see, everything comes through with a machine and very automated, efficient. On the left, you'll see where they're putting those cases together, and those boxes, they'd come around, and there was, I believe, somebody stacking it on a pallet, and then there was, some automation and robotic stacker as well that was shrink wrapping it, and it was amazing to see what they could really, how much beer they could put out in one day.
Yeah, I agree. I thought, I think the whole time I was there, it was taking me back. I remember years ago when we started working in hops through my UVM program, Harpoon was at the table, really, really interested in some possibility of using local hops in particular. And it does feel, I think one of the things that started making me think about a bit when we were there is, yes, they use a huge volume of grain, or hops or beer bottles or whatever it might be. But sometimes, I think making these connections, even at this scale, which seemed really, I think, out of reach for everybody that was there, Sean saying, well, that's all the grain we grow in a whole year, maybe 2, that they're using in a month or a week. But You know, there's always somebody at these bigger businesses that has this vision or drive or commitment to the place that they're at. And sometimes I feel like it's finding that person in these larger businesses or organizations that we can work with. And I know, you know, back in the day, and again, I'm going to refer to Ben here, who should put his camera on because he was one of the original and still is board member with the grain growers. Harpoon now owns what was once Otter Creek and also Woolivers. And I mentioned to our tour guide how they bought grain from Ben Gleason many, many years ago, Ben. I don't even know how long ago that was, and made an organic wheat beer from his wheat grown in Bridport. And, you know, Otter Creek and Woolivers, you know, it was still a smaller brewery, now sort of, I don't want to say gobbled up by Harpoon, but just like reintroducing those ideas to some of these bigger businesses where they should be, you know, really supporting agriculture in their community and trying to figure out ways that make that feasible to them. Like we shouldn't give up on that because they have, and I feel like that's what they always tell us, like, oh, we have this national audience or we have this big audience. How can we help promote your group or what you're doing? And then from our perspective, it's, well, how do we get you to think about using the grain or the hops that we grow right here in your backyard to make some little part of your product? And so, you know, I guess my take home that day was we can't give up on that. And it is feasible. They've done it before. But it's finding that champion, especially within these bigger businesses that want to do that too. I don't know if we found them that day, but we definitely brought this back to them. Like we're still here. There's still farmers here growing grain. Anyway, so that was kind of my take home.
Well, similar to me as well. I even know that they're taking in 25-ton loads of Pilsner malted barley. That's probably Canadian or Western malt, but you know, it would be something where they would want to maybe take an extra step and market a very local beer coming from Harpoon, which I feel they have so many followers. People would jump on that. It would just be a matter of matching what type of volume that they would need for one brew. And I mean, I know we could produce that in Vermont 100%, and then your hops come along with it as well. So I mean, yeah, that maybe they don't switch over to their Harpoon IPA is, you know, has to be all Vermont, but maybe developing a new beer that does, you know, tribute to Vermont grains. And I don't see how that wouldn't be well received, as long as we could, you know, produce that quality grain to them and quality hops. I think it would go. So yeah, keep talking with the big guys, the little guys, and everything on brewery size.
And it's funny, they're not really that big, but they are,
Right.
you know,
Right.
to us, it's huge.
Sean, it's really impressive how many breweries you and Sarah sell your grain to in Vermont and New Hampshire. And I know all that adds up to nice volume, and congratulations to you for, as a farmer, exploring that niche so successfully.
Well, thank you. And I pay some of that to you as well, Todd. We've been in a lot of conversation over the last 3 years at least. And we've made some good contacts together. You've passed my way a few, and, you know, we're working with Foam over in Burlington. They're very supportive of local foam brewers. brewers, and then a handful of breweries up this way as well. Hill Farmstead, Schilling Beer Company over in New Hampshire, and Reckless. So it kind of opened up my eyes when we started growing grain on that, we can use this for flour, we can use it for brewing and cover crop seed, or there's a lot of different directions and
Mhm.
a lot of markets there.
Yeah. Great.
Any other take homes, Sean? I think from any of our field
Yeah.
trips.
I mean, do you want me to touch on New York, or are we gonna get into that after, or?
There's plenty of time to do that if you'd like, and we all have that opportunity.
Yeah, I can, if the next person wants to go, I'll just chime in on what I picked up after we talk about these other places that we visited.
Perfect.
Okay, Seth, I think you're on.
All right. Yeah, I was actually just going to mention that when I started that it would be helpful if anybody else that was along on this trip has any thoughts, or I don't have any notes in front of me. I'm just going to kind of go off the slides. I don't know how many slides there are of Peter's. Is there quite a few, or is it just basic? Or
There's 4.
okay,
Yeah.
that gives me that gives me a little bit of something. So yeah, we I guess this is the first stop in the morning when we went to Peter and Klaus Martin's. I guess this is Peter's operation more than Klaus, but actually Klaus's father came out and joined us. I believe he's actually in this picture here too. He joined us right here. This is at their heifer barn, and this is actually an integral part of for them for growing grain. And Todd, you'll have to remind me. I think they provide they get the manure, right, for growing their grain, but then they provide the straw as bedding to the heifers, right?
That's correct. I was intrigued by all the bartering they do with grain for manure, for straw. It's just a big circular motion, and Peter and his family do that well. And I've never heard of it to that extent, but we know the land needs manure after we take a crop off.
Yeah, and that was really I particularly enjoyed this part just because we do have livestock here on our farm, and much as several grain farmers do, there's always, especially when you're organic, there's always the need for inputs, and it seems like with fewer and fewer farms around to get manure from, the ones that are, or if you can produce your own on-farm manure as they are compost, it's particularly valuable. I know it is in our case, and we always kind of joke with people about our cows. We only have 50 Angus, but there we call them like our nutrient retention program. So we have a small bridge on our farm, and where I'm always telling the kids, like every truckload of hay or straw that leaves across that bridge, we have to have inputs coming in, and the more of that nutrients we can maintain on our farm, either through the form of compost or straw, mulch hay, bedding, or the hay itself, grain, whatever you can feed your own animals, it's really a key input. And then actually this year we were getting a lot of our manure from Pete and Jerry's there in Monroe, New Hampshire, but they actually don't have any more birds now. So that's kind of a great loss to this community. But they've getting back to the Martins, they've had a great relationship, as Todd mentioned, with many of the farms in their area. And we actually spent quite a bit of time in this area here talking about some of the rotations and the way they utilize those inputs. But somebody will have to chime in. How many acres are they farming? Was it 1,300?
1,900 over 4 families. Him and his wife, number 1, mother and father, number 2, and long term hired hand number 3, all together on 1,900 acres.
Yeah, which is huge for many of us, but in the big picture of grain farming, that is it's average or maybe even a little on the small side for a grain farm that would grow 1 or 2 types of crops, maybe wheat or whatever. But they're growing, like, if I remember right, 30 to 40 different types of grain, which is really mind-boggling when you think of all the logistics of rotations and all the handling and trying to keep crops separate. It really is quite impressive. So when you first drive up, this is what you see. This is kind of I believe their main intake area. They have dryers. They have some new bins, which would be just to the left of the picture. I don't know if there's any pictures of those, but they have quite a few storage bins as well, with a new dryer that they just installed. And the dryer is really an important part, especially in our area. Many times you can get by without drying small grains, but actually I was really fortunate. I don't have a dryer myself, but I saw the real importance of that last year. I had some wheat that I harvested that was not quite dry enough, but we had like a week of rain coming up, and air wasn't passing through it anymore. And so I called up my friend Sean, who's only 20 minutes away. I was like, "Can you help me out? It's probably not going to make it if we can't get some heat on it." So Sean and Sarah were actually headed out of town, believe it or not, that day. But he kind of gave me a crash course on what to do, and I was able to use his dryer to actually save that particular bin of grain. So I was really thankful for that. So it just goes to show why, if you can't have every piece of equipment that you need to start, it's important to have this network of other farmers. And the more of us, that are doing this in this area, you don't necessarily need to have every single thing. If you can share certain things or have things cooperatively together, it's really a benefit. And I think that's been part of the success of the Martins too, is having those several farms. He mentioned how they don't all have every piece they need, but actually, I believe he hires out his equipment to some of the other farms, and then they pay him a custom rate. Of course, sometimes you come up into some issues with whose grain do you harvest first when it's ready, and you're going to have some of that give and take, I think, in any of those relationships. But they've been able to make it work, and it was really an inspiration. So there's another picture of that heifer barn. And then to the right, I don't know if there's any more pictures of the processing facility, but that was quite impressive for those of us, especially that are in the grain cleaning business, to see a kind of a turnkey operation. I don't remember. Does anyone remember, Sean or Heather, what they spent on that? I know they mentioned it, but
Oh, I do remember them mentioning it. It all was purchased out of China, if I remember right. And they worked with a company there to develop and design the whole system. It's definitely under $1 million. I do remember that.
Yeah. Are there any more slides?
No, that's the only one in here.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you can see basically everything is really planned out. You can see, it's obviously put in at the same time. They actually, with this particular system, and for anyone that wants to know more about it, I'm sure Peter would be more than happy to tell you. He told us they basically, told the company what they wanted to do, what they wanted to achieve, what they wanted to clean, and they basically set this whole system up for them. And basically had a pre-cleaner going into the facility, dust and quality control as far as the air, and the environment was very clean, and that they've done a lot of work. Actually, they have an extensive air filtration system. All of their gravity tables, destoners, scalpers, optical sorters, everything has hoods over it, which is really important. Many of the older equipment doesn't have that, and you end up, after ingesting years and years of dust and things like that, it really does take a toll on your health. And as far as the quality of the grains, it really shows if you can have a clean facility like that right from the get-go. Not everyone's able to start at this scale right away, but Jeanette, actually, my wife, came with me, and we were particularly interested. We actually broke away with Klaus and looked at the optical sorter, which is a really state-of-the-art camera system with cameras and computer controlled parameters, but it's a necessary, becoming more and more necessary for quality control as far as color sorting. And we're particularly interested in that because we grow a lot of dry edible beans, and really the only way to sort out some of the off colors and things like that is either with one of these machines, an optical sorter, which they have, or by hand, which we're currently doing. But and anybody who's ever sorted grain, Todd can attest to the fact, sorting lots of vetch out of rye by hand, I believe that it's very time consuming, and it really kind of limits what you can do, in a day or a week. So this is their warehouse, really, really nice, very clean, climate controlled. They found that as far as storage of grains, particularly beans, they have a lot less issues with coloring as far as darkening of pinto beans or other grains. If it's kept, I can't remember what it was in there. Was it 60 degrees or 55 degrees? I mean, it was definitely cool. You can see everyone has their hats and coats on, but they're actually also a hub for Albert Lee and Viking seeds as well. So a lot of the grain that you see might not necessarily be grain that they grew, but they're using their facility as a hub for some different seed companies and stuff. So it's a way that I'm sure they're leveraging some of their capital and their infrastructure to also make some extra money doing things like that, which is an important part, I should mention, of really, any small farms here, especially in Vermont, but anywhere in the Northeast. If you can be diverse and have not necessarily put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, but have several different streams of income or different things, because not everything always works out every year. And I think that's part of the reason they're doing so many different types of grains, and have heifers, and have a warehousing for seed and things like that. Is they're doing the same thing where they really are trying to diversify the income stream. And I think that's they've been a real success story. I know this is the first time I've heard of Klaus from years back. I've actually talked to him several times on the phone, but it was the first time I'd actually got to go to their facility. And yeah, so I don't know if there's anything anyone else wants to add, but
I noticed, thanks, Anna. She put a few more photos in the chat of the grain cleaning facility that was there, which was great. It was really great to see. I don't know, Sean or Todd. We learned a lot, so
Yeah.
it's hard to even
It was
capture everything.
It was interesting to hear about Peter's rodent problem. And I felt great pain when he talked about having to take everything out of this room one day last year to work on the rodent issue. And we understood that they come in on bags of grain from Albert Lee and other places. And, of course, we're much smaller here on the farm, but it's nice to find out about other challenges so we can keep an eye out for that, because the kitty cats can't do it all. And that was fascinating to me as we walked around this room.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty interesting to hear how diverse his rotations were, which is definitely something that is needed in our grain growing. We basically can't grow the same crop on that tract of land 2 times in a row. You're kind of asking for problems, is what I've learned, and I'm learning talking to everyone else. But it's a very diverse rotations with cover crops, a lot of clovers mixed in. And I can't remember what he said, but I want to say it was at least 8 years before they came back on that field with that same like a spring wheat. it would be 8 years till they came back, and everything in between was very different crops to differentiate and basically break up any pest cycles and improve the soil health. And that's something that I've been trying really hard on our farm to find. And every time I hear rotation comments, I pay attention, because it's almost like you need a market for every crop that you're putting in as your rotation. So that's what has been difficult for me to figure out. But having animals on the farm, which they do, that puts another aspect to your rotations, where you can maybe feed some of that as baleage or forage. And that's something that we're applying here. We've got 350 heifers, so we're working hard to put that together, and it helped me kind of pick up some tips on that as well.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that, yeah, as a farmer, you know, like say you're a wheat farmer out in the Midwest, and all you do is produce wheat. I mean, that's like, you know, for a lot of farmers, that's what they, you know, that's fine for them, and they have a good market, a commodity market. You're basically going to get paid what the market will pay. But if you want to do something more on the scale of what many farmers do here in the Northeast, you might have a particular crop that's really successful, that you can make money at, that's well. But like then when you try to work in those rotations, sometimes the challenge can be, yeah, you can grow those other grains, but then finding a market that's lucrative, or will at least pay for the off year when you're not growing your cash crop, so to speak. That can be sometimes what's challenging. You know, you can grow it, sure, but then can you sell it, or or will the other crop help support some of that, or, you know, whatever. That's always the little bit of the challenging part with rotations, is just finding markets for those other, you know, crops that may be in a little less demand.
Yeah, I feel that this, when we heard from Amber Lamke last week, in some ways, she understands that. I think she does understand it, and has tried to build more than a cereal grain operation to be able to create an avenue for farmers to rotate their crops, because she understands that in order to have rotations, good soil health, you know, like strong agricultural systems, you can't just grow the same crop. But in order to be more diverse, there has to be a market for the other crops from an economic perspective. And so I think, Todd, you said her bean line is called Rotation.
It is. It's brilliant marketing with those beautiful 1 pound bags she sells with a lot of Seth's beans.
Yeah. So I think she's, you know, and she has other grains and beans, and, you know, thinking about how to create these market opportunities so that farmers also are able to rotate properly. And I know it's just been a challenge as people start to explore cereal grains in particular, especially coming out, I think, often of livestock systems, you know, like Sean was mentioning, just now realizing like, okay, this is different than what I used to do when I was dairy farming. We could get away with different things. You know, you can grow grass for many, many years and not have any problems, you know, and even corn for silage, just a totally different beast. But with food grade grains and, you know, it's just, you got to have a better rotation. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to build it if you don't have a place to sell the crops in rotation.
Well, sometimes too, from a farming standpoint, you're like, all right, I got all the equipment I need. Like I can rotate between, you know, wheat and barley and rye pretty easy. But then when you start looking at rotations, you really need to rotate out into different types of crops or classes, like say beans or sunflowers or, you know, something else. And then you're like, wait a second, I thought I had everything. Now you're like, I need all this other equipment, you know?
I know, so, that's true.
So Jeanette's always like, wait a second, I thought we had everything. Why do you now need this?
Yeah. I think, Seth, that might be just an excuse for you to get more.
Yeah.
But that's a really good point, because I know so many people have said, oh, we'd like to grow dry beans, but the barrier often is, like learning a whole new type of crop and operation. Sarah in the chat said, and timings of all these different plantings and infrastructure that you need to be more diverse sometimes is, as big of a barrier as finding a market. So
Yep.
it's a really good point.
Maybe it's time for me to have a confession.
Oh no. In front of everybody?
I'm going to get it over with.
Okay.
When Heather told me 5 years ago that I couldn't just grow rye on 80 acres, I listened with respect, but I wanted to not want that to happen. And it did. We only have 80 acres. And after growing barley and rye for the first 2 years, we just grew rye because we had a strong market at Caledonia Spirits and a good contract to sell to them and bakers. And I did not have the other equipment. And I did not have more acres than 80. And now the land has just become such that we're probably going to harvest our last crop this August and move on to a grain center in Ferrisburg because we do not have the rotation. So it's a real textbook case of what you predicted, Heather, has happened. And I appreciate your clairvoyance with that.
I don't want to laugh about it, but no, I know I appreciate that confession, but I think on the other side of it, you said, well, what am I supposed to do? And I'm like, I don't know, but you got to rotate, so it's easier to say it than, as everybody knows, to like get that into practice, especially when you're land limited and you got bills to pay and all those things. It's just, but all right,
Well,
we should probably keep rolling along here because we did visit several more places, and the next farm we went to was Tor Oechsner's farm, which is I believe called Simpleton Farm is the name that he chose, and he explained to us why that was, and because his, theory or his, way that he likes to operate his farm is to keep it simple. And we really saw, and we saw that in so many ways. And that didn't mean that it was simple and not productive, simple and neglected, or simple and not as, sort of successful. Highly, again, successful grain farm, organic grain farm in New York, very close to the Martins, completely different operations. And so it was really nice, I think, for us to see that kind of diverse set of group of farms and how they did things, sometimes the same, but often very, very different. And their approaches, were also different. Tor, if anybody knows him or has met him, just super excited, very welcoming, really funny, and, just really wonderful visit. I think Seth mentioned, he's been farming and calling Klaus Martins for years and years and never visited his farm. And I would say that is the same for me with Tor and Klaus. After all these years, just being able to see their operations and see them in action was really, really fun. And Tor also, he's not from a long line of farmers. He would spend summers, at an uncle, I think, or grandfather's dairy farm, and really fell in love with farming, went to Cornell, graduated. He ran a Volkswagen mechanic operation, which if anybody's ever owned an older Volkswagen, such as myself, you have to have your own mechanic to keep those things running. So it was very successful because he had plenty of business, but he really wanted to farm and slowly, kind of built a farm from scratch, from nothing, a few acres, and with vegetables and then getting interested in grains. And now I want to say it's 1,200 acres roughly, or 2,200.
600.
How many?
600 max, now downsizing.
Okay. And he's got a couple of young, also really want to farm individuals there that are helping him. And I think he's really excited to be able to cultivate a next generation of grain farmers. He grows a diversity of grains, another person with a longer rotation so that he can, successfully grow organic grain, in particular corn and wheat and buckwheat, and a variety of other crops. But I think, the thing that interested me about his story was him sort of realizing that if he turned this grain into flour, he could add value, and sort of started along this path thinking that it would be simple, realizing it was complex, but eventually ending up being one of the co-founders of Farmer Ground Flour. And I think Randy will probably talk about that next. But I think we were all captivated by Tor and truly the simplicity of what he was doing. It felt really attainable, I think, for all of us, that it seemed like something we could do too. You didn't look at maybe the technology or the scale and feel like, oh boy, we could never achieve that. Even though Tor's growing on a lot of acres, everything we saw, I think we all felt like, oh, I could do that, or oh, that makes sense, and he was just so excited to share with us the grain cleaning and the sort of innovations that he had done, right down to the simplest thing, which I should have contributed this photo because it was actually my favorite part of the tour. Besides controlling pests in the grain bin. I don't see a picture of it, but underneath this red bin, if you look off into the landscape, you can see a wheelbarrow there. And I think that had to be my favorite part, where he was talking about every time they move grain or touch the grain, they're trying to clean it. And he was talking about struggling trying to move this blower around, and then realized one day that it would be much easier to move around if he put it on top of this wheelbarrow. And just like revolutionized their whole operation, where when they're unloading the grain, they like hustle this wheelbarrow over with a fan and blow out chaff and, dust as they're moving the grain, into wherever it's going next. And I had to say that was probably my favorite thing. So I'll let others, because I know people really enjoyed this part.
Yeah, Tor's a good example of how, you don't need to necessarily start out with $1 million. I mean, this old clipper we're looking at here, I believe it's a clipper, is probably, like Todd said, from like the 1950s. And, they do actually a really good job, and they work off the same principle as the brand new, really expensive machines. But if you don't have much to start with, he kind of started with something really simple. And I wanted to add too that Tor is like really personable. I mean, anybody who's ever met him at meetings and things like that, farming can be stressful, and, some years you don't make much, or, it doesn't seem like it, and you're doing all this work for what. But he still is so witty, and like his one-liners are like, I mean, it's just, he's just a pleasure to know and to be friends with. And anybody who has the opportunity to even talk to him, I've talked to him several times on the phone, he's more than willing to share his time with you, which is really valuable.
As a interesting way of addressing farm succession, Todd referred to what the Martins have done with the different families running their own farms, distinct farms. And Tor's version of this is, I think he doesn't have kids of his own, at least they're not on the farm. So his employees are required to start their own business on the farm and have a little farm business of their own. He might not have mentioned this on the tour. This might have been when we spent time with him at dinner. And so they may or may not continue on with this, the employees, but they get a sense of what it's like to run a farm while working for Tor. I mean, like to really run a farm.
Yeah. John, anything, or Todd, you gleaned from that visit? I'm
New
sure a
York
lot.
State, New York State is a great treasure of old, say 60-year-old milling machines and cleaning machines like we're seeing here. Tor had one from Clipper, and another one I think we're looking at on the right is another company. But all across that Empire State, there's still some of these hidden away in barns. And if anyone finds one, please let me know.
Right.
Yeah, for me, it was, I really liked spending time with Tor. I talked, same with Seth. I talked to him on the phone a couple times now, but it was great to meet in person. And, you know, my wheels were turning when we got to looking at his facility, and I'm like, that's the stuff that I do. Like, I can fabricate those things, but I just, to see it in person is almost like what I've been trying to dream in my head, because that's one of our next phases, is building a more efficient cleaning system and less 5-gallon buckets and breaking our backs. So it was really cool. The other thing was, I liked how he has a lot of grain bins, but they're not really big. They're smaller grain bins that hold plenty of grain. I want to say they're probably a couple thousand bushels, maybe less, but just multiple bins where you can differentiate crops. You can give one time to clean out. He had some interesting thoughts on organic, pest control, just cleaning out the bin. I believe he was using BT, I think, instead of DE. So it was very interesting to kind of just, I don't want to say a simple approach. It's not simple. He's very smart. But just a straightforward, like, don't overthink it. Like, if you want grain to go up to the top, just put an auger up there and put some cable clamps on it and get it done. You don't need to spend $50,000. You can do it with $800 and some scraps in the back of the shed. So that's what I really liked.
Yeah. There were a lot of laughs shared, for sure. So I do want to move on and make sure we have enough time for Randy to talk about farmer ground and kind of taking all that grain and moving it to processing and then on to eating it. So.
Yes. Well, people spoke at the beginning about the connections that the Northern Grain Growers have facilitated for so many of us. And, at this point, thanks to those kinds of connections, our bakery uses flour and some grains that are coming completely from farmers we know within the Northeast. And the one operation that we buy from that I had not been to before was Farmer Ground Flour. And as someone just said, this was started by Tor. I think it was Heather that mentioned that he realized pretty early on that in order to make the grain growing thing work, he needed to find a way to deal with the next step, the processing. So he was very fortunate in finding Greg Russo to operate that. And Greg still runs the mill, and I speak with him fairly regularly, but it was really exciting to go there. We in the bakery bought a mill from New American Stone Mills a few years ago to mill all of our whole grain. And I thought that I would get a bolter for that when we first bought it. And then I discovered how good Farmer Ground's bolted flour is and realized I didn't need to bother with that. And I could focus on milling whole grain, which eliminates some investment and a big step in the process. These guys specialize in, I think most of the flour that they mill is bolted flour, meaning it's stone ground and sifted. And they do it in a two-stage process, which is a little bit more sophisticated than this type of flour, than the way that this type of flour is often milled. But it is a method that's been used for a very long time in European countries. And so their grain goes through a meadows mill in the first stage to break it coarsely, and then it goes up to a bolter to be separated. I think that might be the corn mill, but it is upstairs, and that picture on the right is from upstairs. And then it goes back down to a New American Stone Mill made in Elmore by Andrew Hine. That, I believe that's the final pass. I don't think that there's another bolting step, but I could be wrong about that. Anyhow, we're very familiar with this flour, and what has evolved here over the course of more than 20 years. Tor said he started farming in '97, and it wasn't that much longer before they got farmer ground flour established. And so now farmer ground buys a lot of grain from Tor, but a lot of grain from other farmers in the area. So it appears to me that one of the things I didn't know was that Tor almost single-handedly has seemed to have created this little grain economy there, and it all ends up at farmer ground flour, which sells a lot of flour to bakers in New York City, but we also, of course, get it over here in Vermont. I think probably their primary market is the city. It's always exciting when we go to these kinds of tours, and then I see the connection. I mean, these pallets of flour actually have our Red Hen name on them. They're headed our way. So I remember the first time we bought grain. I went over to get flour from Aurora Farms, Tom Kenyon's farm in Charlotte. And this is about 15 years ago now. And we had been buying grain from Ben for at least 5 years before that. And seeing all of these experiences, including this one here shown in this picture, connecting the bakery to the mill or the farm is what it just never ceases to excite me. That's a very unusual, or it used to be a much more unusual experience than it is now. Fortunately, this is not as unusual as it used to be, because people, I'm not the only baker that's excited to connect to the place that the grain comes from. Someone just asked about what comes out in the first pass, and that's a good question. Primarily bran, almost completely bran. If your mill is running properly in this type of system, it's you want to only be taking off bran. If you're losing any
sorry, is this picture show that or no? To the left.
I'm not sure. That's an interesting picture.
Well, I felt like he was pulling out flour from different stages of the whole process.
Yes, he absolutely was. And when you go to what is called a gradual reduction mill, which most of them are roller mills, but this is a stone mill version of the same thing. That's one of the fun things you can do from these tubes that are transporting the grain in its various stages of being milled around the mill. You can open up the chute and get a little sample of what it's looking like at that point. And so the idea, the stones are dressed specifically with bolting in mind, and the reason that works is the way that they're dressed is so that the bran comes off in larger flakes, as large as possible, so that the bolter, which is a sifter, is going to hold back the bran and let primarily endosperm and critical in a stone mill system germ, which is mostly fat, just that easily combines with the endosperm and passes through the sifters so that it can go into the final flour. So they also mill corn into polenta. That on the right is their corn mill. That's a Osti-Roller from Austria. And so that also involves some refinement. They're taking the pericarp off of the corn there. So smaller production on that, but I think a pretty critical product for them. And then they also mill plenty of whole grain, where they will only use a bolter to remove any remaining chaff after the cleaning, or perhaps even any other foreign matter.
Actually, I wanted to add real quick, Randy, if you look in that picture of the corn mill, he actually has a small gravity table underneath that. If you look, it's just above the yellow buckets. And that's the first time I've ever heard of anybody using a gravity table for that, but he's separating the two different densities of corn, I believe, with that, because one is more dense and harder than the other. And usually, it's not a gravity table, it's a destoner. It works similar to a gravity table, but it's a vibratory destoner. And it's a really small little Forsberg. And they're designed to take like stones out of grain or beans, but they're actually using it to separate the two different densities of corn right there. So that was kind of interesting.
Wow, that's neat. I hadn't caught that. That's great to see. At a late stage in the process, right before it goes into the mill.
Yep.
We moved on to Wide Awake Bakery, and we intentionally had this trip coincide with a testing day and a half that we did for June Russell's organization. This was actually this is part of a project that is has been at least a decade in the works, that Julie Dawson, who used to be at Cornell and has moved on to the University of Wisconsin, and she's working on a winter wheat breeding program, and is quite close to being able to release some seed. And the final multi-stage part of this process is for bakers around the country to test this flour that comes from the grains that she's growing. So we had 5 grains, 5 wheat samples that had been milled at a mill in the Midwest, and we were joined by these bakers. There on the right are 2 bakers from She-Wolf Bakery in Brooklyn, New York, and there were people from about a dozen different bakeries in the Northeast that all joined together for a day and a half to actually do these tests together, which was really exciting. And we had the exciting moment of having Tor and his team come by to see what we were working on. So this is one of these situations again where we're blurring the lines intentionally between farmer, miller, and baker, and getting them all working together. So there on the right is Stefan Sanders, the owner and operator of Wide Awake. And I should mention, I didn't know this before either, that Tor had a role in getting Wide Awake Bakery going. So he really he wanted to see this all the way through, and so his grain, he's involved in the process from field right to oven. That oven is a remarkable piece of equipment. It was built right there based on a Spanish design with what appeared to be some pretty significant improvements over the manufactured ovens that come from Spain, and it was a real homegrown thing, wood-fired round oven with a hearth that turns around. So these are the test loaves that we were baking in, and we had a 6th sample that was Farmer Ground's regular flour that all of the bakers there were familiar with, the bolted flour that I was referring to almost as that was kind of as the control. There's June on the right in the rear, and one of the other bakers from She-Wolf examining our results. I'm interested in anything else that others have to contribute about this. I don't know how deep we want to get into the results. I mean, this is, I guess I'll say that a big interest, the reason that Julie has been particularly interested in looking at trying to develop a winter wheat that does well for bakers and for farmers is because farmers really like growing winter wheat typically because the yields are higher, the weed pressure is lower. And in the Northeast, probably, I think still more farmers are growing spring, finding better success with bakers if they're growing spring wheat. So the challenge is to find good winter wheat varieties that have good agronomic qualities and also good baking qualities. So that's the thrust of this project.
Yeah, and then the bread came back here home to Vermont, and the UVM sensory team also did sensory on the loaves, trying to provide more information back to the breeders and the bakers around the flavor and taste and aromas of each of the bread or each of the samples. So quite exciting, and I hope everybody on the call can see just sort of how, as a group and a community, we've really tried to make these really important connections. And I think engagement of all facets of the industry has been a real success, but it also helps to continue to grow and get people excited. So,
There's a question.
Go ahead.
What are the main baking qualities you are not finding presently available? Well, I would say that in general, winter wheat that's grown in the Northeast, and this is different if it's grown in, Steve Jones out of the University of Washington has a term called wheat grown out of place, out of the place that we associate with the major wheat growing areas of the world. And the Northeast would certainly be considered one of those out of place locations. And so when winter wheat is grown in the Northeast, most of the varieties that farmers will grow will yield wheat with lower protein. And that makes it tough from a gluten development standpoint, and loaf volume typically suffers. We get a denser crumb, as we call it. So it's not as marketable a loaf of bread. There have been there are some notable exceptions to that rule. Redeemer is a variety of wheat that Ben Gleason started growing at least 15 years ago. Tom Kenyon was growing it, is still growing it, I think. And we buy Redeemer wheat now from Joe Hescock, who's in Shoreham. And that variety has dependably produced protein levels of 1.5 to 2% higher than other winter wheats that we typically see. But it's always good to have more diversity. We all know that that's a good thing. And Heather could speak to this, I'm sure, but I believe that Redeemers, it can be susceptible to Fusarium. Is that correct, Heather?
Yeah, I mean, it actually has good Fusarium tolerance, but it's susceptible to a lot of foliar diseases, and it's definitely a variety that doesn't like the clay soils that much. And so I know that, I mean, Tom or Aurora Farms grows it because bakers really like it as a winter variety that somehow manages to produce like really decent protein. Everything else will be 8 and 10%, and Redeemer will still come through at 12. I've even seen it at 14% as a winter wheat, which is just sort of unbelievable. But it has some other challenges. But yeah, so I think with Julie's project, just trying to find those varieties that can maintain that protein is really critical, especially, you know, in organic production because of weed management, or for any of us really. I mean, we all want less inputs, regardless of how you choose to farm. So something that can kind of be viable from that perspective is wonderful. We do, let's see here. I think we have about 5 minutes left. And if anybody has questions, we'll try to answer those. And I think there was one question for you, Seth, about livestock. And let's see here. Do you let your Angus graze over the post-harvest?
Yeah, occasionally. Usually it's for if I have a cover crop underneath it or in a seeding underneath it that's doing really well. But it wouldn't be similar to what they do out in the West, where they might graze large tracts of wheat or triticale, where they're getting feed value from anything that the combine might have missed or whatever. But we do definitely run our animals across, because typically I'll have underseeding of clover or something underneath the grain. And they seem to do really well on that. So, but it kind of depends on the year and which fields we had the grain in that year. If they're at the farm where it's convenient to graze, or if they're, at a distant field, it wouldn't necessarily be as convenient in that case.
Great. Yeah, if there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We have a few more minutes. Just another plug to become a Northern Grain Growers member. Hopefully you can tell through just our conversation today, hearing from different individuals that have been a part of the organization and network for years, the benefits. I don't think some of us realize at times that have come our way, or opportunities, knowledge, all of those things from just being, a part of this community. I know I've learned a ton, and hopefully been able to share as much, if not more, than what I've learned with everybody else. And I think we all look forward to getting back together in person at our conference next year, and hope that everybody can join us. And to any of our speakers, any last comments?
Yeah, Heather,
before we depart?
I was going to say just a bit of thanks and touch on the this network of grain growers that we're all involved together, and just really the nuts and bolts of starting our business. My wife and I, it really had come from people right on this chat, including you, Heather, back from trials, varieties, questions I had for you, the trip to Quebec that you invited me on. Todd, we've worked together. You let us rent your bin, our first year in business, traded for planting your rye. That was a huge thing. Heather, you introduced me to Seth, and Seth did our combining because we didn't have a combine. And all the questions I've sent Seth's way, and hey, my combine's doing this. What do I do now? Because we've just bought our own. So that, and even back to Jack Laser, Heather, you and I went up to Jack's and we had coffee, and he gave us a tour of the grain facility. We bought one of his augers, and that auger's at our place, and it's just huge. It gives me goosebumps, and I don't think I say thank you enough to you all that have really helped me 110% get this started. So thank you.
Well, that's really nice. And yeah, I mean, I think we learned at a young age to share and give back. And I think for all of us that have learned so much from each other, we're always willing to just, help somebody else, because that's how we all got started, and wouldn't be successful today without those people sharing. And I hope through all the webinars we've held over the past 3 years, not being able to get together, that people have seen that and heard that loudly over the last 5 webinars that we've done, that we're excited to be a part of growing grain here in the Northeast. And we're not going away, and we're here to continue to build the industry all around us. And any last words, Todd? He doesn't like to be called our presidente, but he is. So
Thank you, everybody. Let us continue the collaboration. My heart's desire is in 12 months after the New York trip, go to New York, Hudson Valley, and after that to Maine, and then to Vermont. So let's continue to share and collaborate, and thank you for all on this today. Together, we are all stronger as we continue to rise the tide of grain farming in the region. Take care.
all right, everyone. Thank you again, and have a great spring and growing season. And hopefully
Thank
we'll
you.
see y'all soon.